Sometimes, the ones you overlook carry more strength than you could ever imagine. A silent observer can be more powerful than the loudest voice in the room, and when they strike back, it's a blow no one sees coming. They mocked the janitor, never imagining that one day he would be the one to topple their hierarchy. The fluorescent lights buzzed to life in the hallways of Horizon Dynamics, a prestigious company nestled in the heart of downtown. As the first light of dawn broke over the skyline, Marcus Lee, often called Mark, arrived with his trusted cleaning cart in hand, his weathered fingers gripping the handle firmly. At 52, Mark's salt and pepper hair and the lines etched deeply into his face told the story of a man who had weathered life's storms. For more than 2 decades, he had walked these halls, cleaning floors, emptying trash bins, and keeping the office immaculate before anyone arrived. Mark moved quietly, like a shadow slipping through the maze of cubicles and glass-walled offices. The early morning stillness was his silent companion, a contrast to the storm of activity that would soon descend as the corporate gears turned. As Mark worked, his thoughts wandered to the years he had spent in this very place. Years of hard work, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to a job that others saw as insignificant. By 7:30 a.m., the first employees began to trickle in, the sound of designer shoes tapping against the freshly polished floors filling the air. Mark greeted each person with a gentle smile and a quiet "good morning." Some responded with a curt nod, while others passed by, eyes glazed over as though he were invisible. This was a dance Mark had grown accustomed to, its steps ingrained into his daily routine after years of repetition. As the day buzzed to life, Mark couldn't help but notice the whispers and sideways glances that followed him, as if his presence alone was out of place. Fragments of their conversations drifted toward him, floating like unspoken judgments. Why doesn't he get a better job? I can't believe he's still here. Just a janitor. The weight of their assumptions hung heavily in the air, a reminder of the invisible wall between Mark and the corporate elite he served. Their casual dismissiveness, dripping with a mix of pity and disdain, only reinforced the unspoken hierarchy. Among the crowd of tailored suits and gleaming ties, one figure always stood out: James Carter, the CEO of Horizon. Carter was a man whose very presence demanded attention. His expensive cologne announced him before he even stepped into view, and as he strode through the office, employees scrambled to look busy, their expressions shifting between adoration and fear. Mark was quietly emptying a trash can near the break room when Carter approached, flanked by 2 junior executives hanging on his every word. Hello friends, right now, write in the comments your name and where you are watching this video from. We really appreciate each of you. You are incredibly important to us and to the promotion of our channel. Thanks to you, we can tell such stories and open our eyes to injustice. You are our inspiration, and together, we can make this world a better place. Enjoy watching. Well, if it isn't our resident cleanup crew, Carter sneered, his voice loud enough to ensure others heard. Tell me, Marcus, do you ever dream of doing something bigger? Or is pushing a mop the summit of your ambition? The junior executive snickered at Carter's words, their laughter a well-rehearsed chorus of sycophantic agreement. Mark felt the familiar sting, the knot of frustration tightening in his chest. But he had long since learned to suppress it. He met Carter's eyes steadily, his voice calm as ever. The greatest power lies not in those who boast loudly, but in those who listen quietly, observing the world from the shadows. In the silence of their struggles, they craft the strategy that will one day upend the world of those who underestimated them. Mark felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a mixture of anger and hurt, emotions he had long since learned to suppress. He met Carter's gaze evenly, his voice steady as he replied, "Every job has its dignity, Mr. Carter. I take pride in mine." Carter scoffed, turning to his companions. "You hear that, gentlemen? Our janitor fancies himself a philosopher. Maybe we should ask him for investment advice next." The trio erupted in laughter, walking away and leaving Mark to absorb the sting of their mockery. As the day dragged on, Mark continued his rounds, each interaction serving as a reminder of his lowly place in the corporate hierarchy. The racial undertones in their remarks were subtle, but unmistakable. a raised eyebrow here, a condescending tone there. It was a language Mark had learned all too well over the years, every microaggression adding another layer to the thick skin he had carefully developed. But beneath the uniform of a janitor beat the heart of a man with depths unknown to those who brushed him aside. Mark's sharp eyes missed nothing. He absorbed every detail of the office dynamics. He noticed the power plays, the shifting alliances, and the whispered secrets exchanged in the corners of conference rooms. In the quiet solitude of his work, Mark's mind never rested. He processed information, made connections that others, blinded by their own self-importance, failed to see. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the office, Mark prepared to end another day. He gazed out at the city skyline, the twinkling lights a testament to the dreams and ambitions fueling the concrete jungle. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, concealing a secret that no one at Horizon Dynamics could have ever imagined. A secret that, when revealed, would turn their world upside down. As Mark made his way home on the crowded subway, his thoughts drifted back to a time when his dreams seemed just within reach. The rhythmic clatter of the train carried him to memories of a sunlit college campus, where a younger Mark strode confidently across the quad, arms filled with finance textbooks, his mind brimming with ambition. In those days, Marcus Lee was a rising star at the State University. His natural aptitude for numbers and business strategy earned him accolades from both professors and peers alike. He recalled late nights spent poring over case studies, the thrill of cracking complex financial models, and the camaraderie of study groups, where he often took the lead. His dissertation on emerging market trends had even caught the attention of several prestigious firms, promising a bright and prosperous future. But, as Mark had come to realize, life rarely followed a straight path. When life closes doors that should open, some give up. But for others, the obstacles become stepping stones, and the silent struggle transforms into a quiet power that builds empires in the shadows. The memory of Mark's graduation day, once filled with hope and excitement, slowly gave way to the harsh reality that followed. Despite his impressive credentials, the doors that should have swung wide open barely cracked for him. Interviews that began with enthusiasm would often end with empty promises to keep his resume on file. The subtle, unspoken dance of systemic racism played out in boardrooms and HR offices, where Mark's qualifications were quietly overshadowed by candidates who fit the company's culture better. As the rejection letters piled up, Mark found himself at a difficult crossroads. His aging parents, who had sacrificed everything for his education, now needed his financial support. His younger sister's college tuition loomed on the horizon, another burden waiting to be shouldered. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, forcing him to make a decision that would change the course of his life. It was then that Mark accepted a janitor's position at Horizon Dynamics. What was supposed to be a temporary solution turned into a journey spanning over 2 decades. Yet even as he donned the uniform that would define him in the eyes of others, Mark never let go of his ambitions. In the still hours of the night, after his shift had ended and the world fell silent, Mark's real work would begin. He pored over financial reports, analyzing market trends with the same passion and dedication he once had in college. His small apartment transformed into a makeshift war room, the walls covered in charts, projections, and market analyses. With the little savings he managed to set aside, Mark began investing. His initial investments were modest, but as his predictions repeatedly proved accurate, he grew bolder. Years passed, and while the corporate world continued to overlook the janitor in their midst, Mark's portfolio flourished in silence. He diversified into emerging technologies, spotting potential in startups before they became household names, and navigated market crashes with a calm, steady hand. The very skills that had once earned him accolades in university were now quietly building a hidden empire. But Mark's talents extended far beyond just personal financial gain. Ironically, his position as a janitor provided him with unparalleled access to the inner workings of Horizon Dynamics. Late at night, as he cleaned the executive offices, He couldn't help but overhear critical discussions about mergers, impending layoffs, and strategies that would shape the company's future. His sharp, analytical mind pieced together these fragments of conversation, slowly forming a comprehensive understanding of the firm's operations that even the most senior executives failed to grasp. Mark also took note of the inefficiencies that plagued the company, the redundant processes, wasted resources, and poorly managed teams. He saw growth opportunities that the executives, sitting in their ivory towers, consistently overlooked. Some men lead in silence, while others make noise to be seen. But the quiet ones, the ones who wait and watch, are the ones who change everything when the time is right. Patience isn't weakness, it's power in its purest form. In moments of quiet reflection, Mark often imagined how he would run things differently, how he could transform Horizon Dynamics into a leaner, more efficient powerhouse. As the years slipped by, Mark's double life began to take its toll. The constant disrespect he endured during the day clashed sharply with the growing success he experienced in the shadows. He struggled with the temptation to reveal his true capabilities, to stand tall and demand the respect he knew he had earned. But years of facing closed doors had taught him a valuable lesson: patience. In the unforgiving world of high finance and corporate politics, timing was everything. So Mark waited. He quietly built his knowledge and resources, forming connections in the business world under the guise of a small-time investor. Never once did he reveal the full extent of his holdings or expertise. He watched and waited, knowing that his moment would come, the moment when he could finally step out from the shadows and into the light of recognition. As the subway screeched to a halt at his stop, Mark shook himself from his reverie. He stepped onto the platform, his janitor's uniform hiding the posture of a financial mastermind. Tomorrow would be another day of mops and quiet disrespect. But Mark smiled to himself, a smile only he understood. Little did they know, the game was about to change, and this time he held all the cards. The grand ballroom of the Starlight Hotel buzzed with excitement as Horizon Dynamics celebrated its 50th anniversary. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room, casting a golden glow over a sea of designer suits and shimmering cocktail dresses. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and unspoken ambition. Mark stood off in a corner, his janitorial uniform traded for a rented tuxedo that felt foreign on his shoulders. His presence at the event had been framed as a gesture of inclusivity, a fact the HR department had proudly highlighted in company-wide emails about diversity and inclusion. In a world of power and privilege, sometimes those at the top forget that the ones they step on may rise to levels they never imagined. And when they do, the fall for those at the top can be much harder than they expect. As Mark sipped his glass of champagne, he silently observed the intricate social dynamics unfolding around him. Executives laughed a little too loudly at each other's jokes, mid-level managers maneuvered to get closer to the CEO, and new employees desperately tried to network their way up the corporate ladder. It was a familiar dance, one Mark had witnessed from the sidelines for years. The evening moved forward with speeches celebrating the company's success and endurance. Awards were handed out, backs were generously patted, and the drinks flowed freely. As the formalities began to wind down, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations loosened by alcohol, and that false sense of camaraderie often seen at these types of events emerged. That's when James Carter, riding high on the praise heaped upon him during his keynote speech, spotted Mark from across the room. With a gleam in his eye that clearly spelled trouble, Carter strolled over, flanked by a group of executives who clung to his every word. Well, look who cleaned up nicely," Carter said loudly, his voice ringing out over the nearby tables. "Our very own Cinderella, straight from mopping floors to rubbing elbows with the elite. Tell me, Marcus, how does it feel to see how the other half lives?" A ripple of laughter spread through the group, and Mark could feel every eye in the room turn toward him, a mix of amusement and pity in their gazes. He straightened his back, determined to keep his composure. "It's a lovely event, Mr. Carter. Thank you for including me," Mark replied, his tone calm, though a knot of tension began to tighten in his chest. Encouraged by the reaction of those around him, Carter wasn't ready to let up. "Oh, come now, Don't be so formal. We're all friends here, aren't we? In fact, I think it's time we show some real appreciation for the man who keeps our offices spotless." Turning to the crowd, Carter grinned. "What do you say, folks? Shall we give Marcus here a proper Horizon welcome?" Before Mark could respond, Carter had already thrown an arm around his shoulders, steering him toward the center of the room. The crowd shifted, forming a circle around them, and Mark's heart began to race, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carter announced, his voice booming across the ballroom, "I propose a toast to the unsung hero of Horizon Dynamics, the man who scrubs our toilets, empties our trash, and what else do you do, Marcus? Why don't you enlighten us about the fascinating world of janitorial services?" The room erupted in laughter, the sound loud and harsh, cutting through Mark like a blade. There comes a moment in every silent fighter's life when they decide to stop tolerating injustice, and when they finally speak, their words carry the power to shake the very foundation of those who once overlooked them. Mark stood frozen, the weight of countless stares pressing down on him. He could see amusement etched on some faces, while discomfort flickered in the eyes of others. Yet despite the growing tension, not a single person stepped forward to stop the spectacle unfolding before them. Carter, encouraged by the reaction of the crowd, pressed on with his mockery. "You know, I've always wondered, Marcus, in your expert opinion as a master of the mop, what's the best way to clean up a mess? You must have plenty of experience cleaning up after us important folk, haven't you?" The laughter grew louder, sharper. Mark felt heat rising from his collar, a dangerous mix of humiliation and anger building within him, threatening to break through the calm facade he had maintained for years. Years of pent-up frustration bubbled just beneath the surface, ready to explode. Carter smirked, sensing the rising tension but unfazed. "Come on, Marcus, don't be shy. Share your wisdom with us. Or is pushing a broom the extent of your expertise?" In that instant, something snapped inside Mark. The careful restraint he had held onto for decades cracked, revealing a glimpse of the fire he had kept hidden for so long. His eyes, usually soft and reserved, now blazed with an intensity that made Carter involuntarily take a step back. "Mr. Carter," Mark began, his voice low but steady, carrying across the now silent ballroom. "In my years of service, I've learned that the biggest messes aren't always the ones you can see. Sometimes the real filth is in how we treat each other." Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Mark cut him off, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I may just be a janitor to you, but I've seen and heard more in these offices than you can imagine. I've watched decisions being made that valued profits over people, watched as careers were built on the backs of those deemed expendable." Mark's gaze swept across the room before returning to Carter. "And I've cleaned up messes far greater than anything left on your floors." With that, Mark turned on his heel and walked out of the ballroom, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. As the doors swung shut behind him, he could hear the murmurs of disbelief rising from the crowd. No doubt, by the time morning came, the incident would have been spun into office gossip. In the stillness of the hotel lobby, Mark leaned against a marble pillar, his heart racing. He loosened his bow tie, feeling as though he could finally breathe for the first time in years. The enormity of what he had just done slowly began to sink in. He knew there would be consequences, that his outburst might very well cost him his job. But for the first time in a long time, Mark felt an unfamiliar sense of peace wash over him. And in that moment, he realized that, no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. Patience is a weapon, and silence can be a powerful strategy. The moment you reveal the truth, the entire game changes. And for those who once looked down on you, the realization comes too late. Mark realized that he no longer cared about the consequences. The years of silent suffering, of biting his tongue and swallowing his pride, were finally over. A new sense of resolve crystallized within him. It was time to take action. Time to use the knowledge and resources he had accumulated over the years. As Mark stepped out into the cool night air, he made a firm decision. The game had changed, and he was ready to make his move. The corporate world that had underestimated him for so long was about to learn just how wrong they had been about just a janitor. In the days following the disastrous company party, an air of tension hung over Horizon Dynamics. Whispers followed Mark as he went about his rounds, some laced with newfound respect, others tinged with thinly veiled contempt. James Carter had been conspicuously absent, his booming voice no longer echoing through the halls. But Mark knew that the calm was deceptive. A storm was brewing, even as the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning droned on. But tonight, instead of cleaning supplies and mops, Mark's desk was scattered with financial reports, market analyses, and strategies. His sharp eyes had caught every inefficiency, every poor decision, and every missed opportunity that Horizon's management had overlooked. Now, all of that knowledge was being channeled into a plan that would shake the company to its core. As Mark worked, his mind wandered to a conversation he'd had months ago with Alexander Vance, a powerful investor he'd met at a small coffee shop. Vance had been intrigued by Mark's insights into the market, never suspecting that the man sharing stock tips was merely a janitor. Over time, Mark had carefully nurtured this relationship, dropping hints about Horizon's inner workings while keeping his identity concealed. Now it was time to bring Vance fully into the fold. Mark attached his meticulously prepared report to an email, along with a proposal that would change everything. His finger hovered over the send button for a moment, then with a deep breath, he clicked. The next few weeks passed in a blur of secretive meetings and hushed phone calls. By day, Mark continued his janitorial duties, but by night, he immersed himself in strategy sessions and negotiations. Initially skeptical, Vance became increasingly excited as he began to grasp the true potential of what Mark was proposing. Meanwhile, Horizon Dynamics was descending into crisis. Years of mismanagement and short-sighted decisions were finally catching up with the company. Stock prices plummeted, key clients jumped ship, and the board of directors was thrown into a panic. James Carter, once hailed as the golden boy of the corporate world, now found himself struggling to keep the company afloat. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that Vance made his move. Armed with Mark's insider knowledge, Vance approached the board with a takeover offer that was too good to refuse. The deal was structured to address Horizon's glaring weaknesses while promising a return to profitability, all thanks to Mark's intimate understanding of the company's operations. As the takeover proceedings unfolded, Mark continued his usual routine, mopping floors and emptying trash cans. He watched as executives scurried about in a frenzy, completely oblivious to the fact that the very man they had dismissed for years now held their futures in his hands. There were moments when Mark was tempted to reveal himself, to see the shock on their faces when they realized the truth. But he held back, knowing that timing was everything. The day of the final takeover announcement arrived. The entire company gathered in the main conference room, a sea of anxious faces awaiting news of their uncertain future. James Carter stood at the front of the room, his usual bravado replaced by a pale, sickly expression. As Vance entered the room, flanked by lawyers and board members, a hush fell over the crowd. Vance's announcement was met with a mixture of relief and trepidation. Yes, the company would survive, but significant changes were on the horizon. As Vance outlined the restructuring plan, his gaze swept across the room, finally landing on a figure standing quietly at the back. Mark, still dressed in his janitor's uniform. "And now," Vance said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "I'd like to introduce you to the man who made this all possible. The person whose insights and strategic thinking will guide Horizon into a new era of success." Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd as Vance gestured for Mark to come forward. Slowly, Mark made his way to the front of the room, acutely aware of the shocked expressions and widening eyes that followed his every step. As he took his place beside Vance, Mark finally allowed himself a small smile. The time had come. When the tables turn, the ones who have been overlooked often rise with a clarity and strength that can dismantle empires. The power lies not in status, but in resilience, vision, and timing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vance announced, "meet Marcus Lee, your new Chief Strategy Officer and my partner in this venture." The room erupted in a cacophony of gasps and exclamations. James Carter's face drained of all color as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Mark stood tall, his years of silent observation and careful planning finally coming to fruition. As the shockwaves of the announcement rippled through the company, Mark knew that this was only the beginning. The real work of transforming Horizon Dynamics lay ahead. But for the first time in decades, he felt truly seen. The power had shifted, and with it, the opportunity to create the kind of company he had always envisioned. A company built on respect, innovation, and true merit. Looking out over the sea of stunned faces, Mark cleared his throat. It was time for his first address as an executive. "I know you all have questions," he began, his voice steady and confident, "and I promise every single one of them will be answered. But first, let's talk about the future. A future where every voice is heard, where innovation thrives, and where we redefine what it means to be a truly great company." As Mark spoke, outlining his vision for Horizon's rebirth, he could see the shock on people's faces slowly giving way to something else. Respect, curiosity, even excitement. The power had indeed shifted, and with it the dawn of a new era for Horizon Dynamics had begun. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Horizon Dynamics' executive floor, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The air was thick with tension, as employees hurried to their desks, whispering frantically about the rumors swirling since the takeover announcement. At the center of this storm was the conspicuous absence of James Carter, the now former CEO, whose office remained dark and untouched. As the clock struck 9 a.m., a hush fell over the office. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a sight that made every head turn and every conversation stop mid-sentence. Mark Lee, the man they had known for years as the quiet janitor, stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored suit that radiated confidence and authority. Gone was the stooped posture and deferential demeanor. In its place stood a man who commanded respect with every step he took. Mark strode purposefully toward the main conference room, nodding acknowledgement to the stunned faces he passed. As he approached, he could see through the glass walls that the room was already filled with anxious executives and board members, all awaiting the meeting that would determine the future of the company. With a deep breath, Mark pushed open the door and entered. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. At the far end of the table sat James Carter, his usual bravado replaced by nervous fidgeting, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. "Good morning, everyone," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "I believe we have some business to discuss." He took his seat at the head of the table, a position that, until yesterday, had been occupied by Carter. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "As you're all aware," Mark continued, "Horizon Dynamics has undergone a significant change in leadership. Mr. Vance and I have spent the past week reviewing the company's operations, finances, and personnel. Today, we'll be discussing the path forward." Mark's gaze swept across the room, locking eyes with each person present. Some looked away, unable to reconcile the man before them with the janitor they had ignored for so long. Others met his gaze with a newfound respect and curiosity. "But before we begin," Mark said, his tone shifting slightly, "there's one matter that needs to be addressed immediately." His eyes locked onto James Carter, who visibly stiffened. "Mr. Carter, would you please stand?" The room held its collective breath as Carter slowly rose to his feet, his face a mask of barely contained fury and fear. Mark's voice remained steady as he addressed him. "James Carter, for the past 2 decades, I've watched you lead this company. I've seen your successes and I've witnessed your failures. I've been present for every major decision, every misstep, and every missed opportunity. And I've come to a conclusion that I believe is in the best interest of Horizon Dynamics and its employees." The tables had turned, and the once overlooked janitor now stood at the helm, the weight of the company's future resting on his shoulders. Years of patience and perseverance had led to this moment, and with it came the power to transform everything. Myers attempted to interject, but Mark raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that spoke volumes about the shift in power. "Mr. Carter, effective immediately, your services as CEO of Horizon Dynamics are no longer required. Your position is terminated." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Carter's face twisted in shock and rage. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "You're nothing but a janitor. This is absurd." Mark remained calm in the face of Carter's outburst. "I assure you, Mr. Carter, I am well within my rights as the new Chief Strategy Officer and partner in the company's ownership. Your poor management decisions, ethical lapses, and failure to adapt to changing market conditions have cost this company dearly. It's time for a change." Carter looked around the room, desperate for support, but found none. The other executives averted their eyes, unwilling to align themselves with a sinking ship. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," Carter threatened, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. Mark nodded, unperturbed. "You're welcome to pursue any legal action you see fit, Mr. Carter, but I assure you, every decision made today is backed by thorough documentation of your mismanagement and ethical breaches. Now, I'll have to ask you to leave the premises. Human Resources will contact you regarding the details of your separation package." As if on cue, 2 security guards appeared at the door. Carter, realizing the futility of further protest, gathered his belongings and stormed out, but not before casting one last venomous glare at Mark. The room remained silent for a moment after Carter's departure. Mark allowed the tension to settle before speaking again, his tone more conciliatory. "I understand that this is a shock to many of you. Change can be difficult, especially when it happens so suddenly. But I want to assure you all that my goal is not to dismantle what we've built here, but to strengthen it, to create a company that values innovation, integrity, and the contributions of every employee, regardless of their position." He paused, sweeping his gaze across the room once more. "I've spent years observing this company from a unique vantage point. I've seen its strengths and its weaknesses. And now, I intend to use that knowledge to lead us into a new era of success and ethical business practices." As Mark continued to outline his vision for the future of Horizon Dynamics, he noticed the mood in the room beginning to shift. The initial shock and skepticism were slowly giving way to curiosity and even cautious optimism. The executives who had once looked through him now hung on his every word, scribbling notes and nodding in agreement. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to everyone that a new chapter had begun for Horizon Dynamics. As the room emptied, Mark remained seated, taking a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. The years of disrespect, underestimation, and silent observation had been challenging, but they had also given him a perspective that no other executive could claim. Now, as he looked out over the city skyline from what was now his office, Mark felt a profound sense of purpose and responsibility. He had the power not only to shape the future of the company, but also to impact the lives of every employee within it. And he was determined to wield that power wisely, to create the kind of workplace he had always dreamed of, one where every person, regardless of their role, was valued and respected. The day's events had served as a powerful reminder of the importance of humility and the dangers of arrogance. As Mark prepared to address the rest of the company, he silently vowed never to forget the lessons he had learned as a janitor, even as he embraced his new role as a leader. Now at the center of attention, Mark walked through the office, greeted by a mix of awed stares, respectful nods, and the occasional hushed conversation that abruptly halted as he passed. Mark's first order of business was to address the entire company. In a town hall meeting, streamed live to remote employees and attended by a packed auditorium, Mark stood before his colleagues, still slightly uncomfortable in the spotlight, but determined to set the tone for this new era of Horizon Dynamics. "For years," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I worked among you as a janitor. I cleaned your offices, emptied your trash, and kept our workspace tidy. But I was more than just a janitor. Sometimes the quiet observer holds the most power. And when they speak, the entire room falls silent, for they are no longer defined by their past, but by the strength they have quietly built over time." Myers attempted to interject, but Lenny raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that carried the weight of his new authority. "Mr. Myers, effective immediately, your services as CEO of Everest Corporate Solutions are no longer required. Your position is terminated." The words hung in the air, their finality cutting through the tension in the room. Myers' face twisted in shock and rage. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "You're nothing but a janitor. This is absurd." Lenny remained calm in the face of Myers' outburst. I assure you, Mr. Myers, I am well within my rights as the new Chief Strategy Officer and partner in the company's ownership. Your poor management decisions, ethical lapses, and failure to adapt to changing market conditions have cost this company dearly. It's time for a change. Myers glanced around the room, desperate for support, but found none. The other executives avoided his gaze, unwilling to align themselves with a sinking ship. You'll be hearing from my lawyers, Myers threatened, his voice shaking with anger and humiliation. Lenny nodded, unbothered. You're welcome to pursue any legal action you see fit, Mr. Myers, but I assure you, every decision made today is backed by thorough documentation of your mismanagement and ethical breaches. Now, I'll have to ask you to leave the premises. Human Resources will contact you regarding the details of your separation package. As if on cue, 2 security guards appeared at the door. Myers, realizing the futility of further protest, gathered his belongings and stormed out, but not before casting one final venomous glare at Lenny. The room remained silent after Myers' departure. Lenny allowed the tension to dissipate before speaking again, his tone more conciliatory. I understand that this is a shock to many of you. Change can be difficult, especially when it happens so suddenly. But I want to assure you all that my goal is not to dismantle what we've built here, but to strengthen it. He paused, looking around the room once more. I've spent years observing this company from a unique vantage point. I've seen its strengths and I've seen its weaknesses. Now, I intend to use that knowledge to lead us into a new era of success and ethical business practices. As Lenny continued outlining his vision for Everest's future, he could see the mood in the room beginning to shift. The initial shock and skepticism were slowly giving way to curiosity and even cautious optimism. The executives, who had once looked past him, now clung to his every word, scribbling notes and nodding in agreement. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. A new chapter had begun for Everest Corporate Solutions. As the room emptied, Lenny remained seated for a moment, reflecting on the long journey that had brought him to this point. The years of disrespect and underestimation had been challenging, but they had also given him a perspective no other executive could claim. Now, as he looked out over the city skyline from his new office, Lenny felt a profound sense of purpose and responsibility. He had the power not only to shape the future of the company, but to influence the lives of every employee within it. He was determined to use that power wisely, to create the kind of workplace he had always dreamed of, one where every person, regardless of their role, was valued and respected. The events of the day had been a powerful reminder of the importance of humility and the dangers of arrogance. As Lenny prepared to address the rest of the company, he silently vowed never to forget the lessons he had learned as a janitor, even as he embraced his new role as a leader. As Lenny walked through the office, he was met with a mix of awed stares, respectful nods, and the occasional hushed conversation that stopped abruptly as he passed. His first major task as Chief Strategy Officer was to address the entire company. In a town hall meeting, streamed live to remote employees and attended by a packed auditorium, Lenny stood before his colleagues. Although he still felt slightly uncomfortable in the spotlight, he was determined to set the tone for Everest's new era. For years, he began, his voice steady and clear, I worked among you as a janitor. I cleaned your offices, emptied your trash, and kept our workspace tidy. But I was more than just a janitor. The quietest observers often become the most powerful voices when their time comes. Years of silence and patience culminate in a single moment, and when they finally speak, the world listens. And nothing is ever the same again. I was an observer, a student of this company and its people, Lenny began. I saw the best of Everest, the innovation, the dedication, the potential, but I also saw its flaws, the waste, the mismanagement, and the disrespect that permeated our culture. A hushed murmur rippled through the audience as Lenny continued. His routine had involved mopping floors and emptying trash cans. He had watched as executives scurried about, unaware that the man they ignored held their fates in his hands. There were moments when Lenny had been tempted to reveal his true self, to watch the shock on their faces when they learned the truth. But he held back, knowing that timing was everything. The day of the final takeover announcement arrived. The entire company gathered in the main conference room, a sea of anxious faces awaiting news of their future. Richard Myers stood at the front, his usual bravado replaced by a sickly pallor. As Vance entered the room, flanked by lawyers and board members, a hush fell over the crowd. Vance's announcement was met with a mixture of relief and trepidation. Yes, the company would survive, but there would be significant changes. As he outlined the restructuring plan, Vance's eyes scanned the room, finally settling on a figure standing quietly at the back, Lenny, still in his janitorial uniform. "And now," Vance said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "I'd like to introduce you to the man who made all of this possible. The person whose insights and strategic thinking will guide Everest into a new era of success." Confused murmurs spread through the crowd as Vance gestured for Lenny to step forward. Slowly, Lenny made his way to the front of the room. Acutely aware of the shocked expressions and widening eyes that followed his progress, Lenny finally took his place beside Vance, allowing himself a small, knowing smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vance announced, "meet Leonard Johnson, your new Chief Strategy Officer and my partner in this venture." The room erupted into gasps and exclamations. Richard Myers' face turned pale as the realization of what had happened sank in. Lenny stood tall, his years of silent observation and meticulous planning finally paying off. As the shockwaves of the announcement rippled through the company, Lenny knew this was only the beginning. The real work of transforming Everest lay ahead. But for the first time in decades, he felt truly seen. The power had shifted, and with it, the opportunity to build the kind of company he had always envisioned, one founded on respect, innovation, and true merit. Looking out over the sea of stunned faces, Lenny cleared his throat. It was time for his first address as an executive. "I know you all have questions," he began, his voice steady and confident, "and I promise every single one of them will be answered. But first, let's talk about the future. A future where every voice is heard, where innovation thrives, and where we redefine what it means to be a truly great company." As Lenny continued to outline his vision for Everest's rebirth, he could see the shock on people's faces slowly give way to something else: respect, curiosity, and even excitement. The power had indeed shifted, and with it, the dawn of a new era for Everest Corporate Solutions had begun. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Everest's executive floor, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The air was thick with tension as employees hurried to their desks, whispering about the rumors that had been circulating since the takeover announcement. At the center of this storm was the conspicuous absence of Richard Myers, the now former CEO, whose office remained dark and untouched. As the clock struck 9, a hush fell over the office. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a sight that made every head turn and every conversation stop mid-sentence. Lenny Johnson, the man they had known for years as the quiet janitor, stepped out, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that exuded confidence and authority. Gone was the stooped posture and deferential manner. In its place stood a man who commanded respect with every step. Lenny strode purposefully toward the main conference room, nodding in acknowledgement to the stunned faces he passed. As he approached, he could see through the glass walls that the room was already filled with anxious executives and board members, all awaiting the meeting that would determine the company's future. With a deep breath, Lenny pushed open the door and entered. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. At the far end of the table sat Richard Myers, his usual swagger replaced by nervous fidgeting. His eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. "Good morning, everyone," Lenny said, his voice calm but firm. "I believe we have some business to discuss." He took his seat at the head of the table, a position that, until yesterday, had been occupied by Myers. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The moment of truth comes when those who were once overlooked rise, not with anger, but with purpose. The power that had been built in silence now speaks, reshaping the future and redefining leadership. "As you're all aware," Lenny continued, "Everest Corporate Solutions has undergone a significant change in leadership. Mr. Vance and I have spent the past week reviewing the company's operations, finances, and personnel. Today, we'll be discussing the path forward." Lenny's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of each person present. Some looked away, unable to reconcile the man before them with the janitor they had dismissed for so long. Others met his gaze with a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. "But before we begin," Lenny said, his tone shifting slightly, "there's one matter that needs to be addressed immediately." His eyes locked onto Richard Myers, who visibly stiffened. "Mr. Myers, would you please stand?" The room held its collective breath as Myers slowly rose to his feet, his face a mask of barely contained fury and fear. Lenny's voice remained steady as he spoke. "Richard Myers, for the past 2 decades I have watched you lead this company. I've seen your successes, and I've witnessed your failures. I've been present for every major decision, every misstep, and every missed opportunity. And I've come to a conclusion that I believe is in the best interest of Everest Corporate Solutions and its employees." Myers attempted to interject, but Lenny raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that spoke volumes about the shift in power. "Mr. Myers, effective immediately, your services as CEO of Everest Corporate Solutions are no longer required. Your position is terminated." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Myers' face twisted with shock and rage. "You can't do this," he sputtered. "You're nothing but a janitor. This is absurd." Lenny remained calm, unwavering in the face of Myers' outburst. "I assure you, Mr. Myers, I am well within my rights as the new Chief Strategy Officer and partner in the company's ownership. Your poor management decisions, ethical lapses, and failure to adapt to changing market conditions have cost this company dearly. It's time for a change." Myers looked around the room, desperate for support, but found none. The other executives avoided his gaze, unwilling to align themselves with a sinking ship. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," Myers threatened, his voice trembling with anger and humiliation. Lenny nodded, unperturbed. "You're welcome to pursue any legal action you see fit, Mr. But I assure you, every decision made today is backed by thorough documentation of your mismanagement and ethical breaches. Now, I'll have to ask you to leave the premises. Human Resources will contact you regarding the details of your separation package." As if on cue, 2 security guards appeared at the door. Realizing the futility of further protest, Myers gathered his things and stormed out, casting one final venomous glare at Lenny. The room remained silent for a moment after Myers' departure. Lenny allowed the tension to dissipate before speaking again, his voice taking on a more conciliatory tone. "I understand that this is a shock to many of you. Change can be difficult, especially when it comes so suddenly. But I want to assure you all that my goal is not to dismantle what we've built here, but to strengthen it. To create a company that values innovation, integrity, and the contributions of every employee, regardless of their position." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room again. "I've spent years observing this company from a unique vantage point. I've seen its strengths and its weaknesses, and now I intend to use that knowledge to lead us into a new era of success and ethical business practices." As Lenny continued outlining his vision for the company's future, he could see the mood in the room begin to shift. The initial shock and skepticism were gradually giving way to curiosity and even cautious optimism. The executives who had once looked through him now hung on his every word, scribbling notes and nodding in agreement. The journey from being overlooked to becoming a leader is marked by resilience, humility, and a quiet strength that others may never understand. But those who rise from such humble beginnings carry a wisdom that can shape the future for everyone. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that a new chapter had begun for Everest Corporate Solutions. As the room emptied, Lenny remained seated, taking a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. The years of disrespect and underestimation had been difficult, but they had also given him a perspective that no other executive could claim. Now, as he looked out over the city skyline from the window of his new office, Lenny felt a deep sense of purpose and responsibility. He had the power to shape not just the future of the company, but the lives of every employee within it. Lenny was determined to use that power wisely, to create the kind of workplace he had always dreamed of, one where every person, regardless of their role, was valued and respected. The events of the day had served as a powerful reminder of the importance of humility, and the dangers of arrogance. As Lenny prepared to address the rest of the company, he silently vowed never to forget the lessons he had learned as a janitor, even as he embraced his new role as a leader. Now, he found himself at the center of attention. As he walked through the office, he was met with a mix of awed stares, respectful nods, and the occasional whispered conversation that would abruptly cease as he passed. Lenny's first order of business was to address the entire company. In a town hall meeting streamed live to remote employees and attended by a packed auditorium, Lenny stood before his colleagues. Though still slightly uncomfortable with the spotlight, he was determined to set the tone for the new era of Everest. For years, he began, his voice steady and clear, "I worked among you as a janitor. I cleaned your offices, emptied your trash, and kept our workspace tidy. But I was more than just a janitor. I was an observer, a student of this company and its people. I saw the best of Everest, the innovation, the dedication, the potential. But I also saw its flaws, the waste, the mismanagement, the disrespect that permeated our culture." A hushed murmur rippled through the audience as Lenny continued. "Today we stand at a crossroads. We have the opportunity to build something truly great, not just in terms of profits and market share, but in terms of who we are as a community of professionals. I envision an Everest where every voice is heard, where ideas are valued regardless of the title of the person suggesting them, and where we treat each other with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves." Over the following months, Lenny's words began to take shape in action. He instituted an open-door policy, encouraging employees at all levels to share their ideas and concerns. He revamped the company's hierarchical structure, breaking down silos and fostering cross-departmental collaboration. The toxic culture that had festered under Meyer's leadership slowly gave way to an atmosphere of innovation and mutual respect. "Hey friends, sorry to disturb you. Please take a moment to share your name and where you're watching this video from in the comments. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Your support means the world to us and plays a crucial role in promoting our channel. Because of you, we can share these important stories and shed light on injustices. You inspire us, and together, we can make the world a better place." Enjoy the video. One of Lenny's most significant moves was improving the working conditions and compensation for the company's support staff. The janitors, security guards, and maintenance workers who had long been overlooked. He understood better than anyone the vital role these employees played in keeping the company running smoothly. As the changes took hold, Everest began to flourish. Productivity increased, employee satisfaction soared, and the company's reputation in the industry underwent a dramatic transformation. Clients who had been considering jumping ship now clamored to work with the newly invigorated Everest. But success didn't change Lenny's fundamental character. He remained the same observant, thoughtful man he had always been. He made a point of regularly walking through all areas of the company, talking with employees at every level, always ready to listen and learn. One evening, long after most employees had left for the day, Lenny found himself back in the janitor's closet where he had spent so many years. He ran his hand over the worn handle of his old mop, a small smile playing on his lips as memories of countless hours spent pushing it across those floors came rushing back. From a shelf, he pulled down his old uniform, neatly folded and tucked away. As he held it in his hands, the weight of his journey truly hit him. This simple garment, once a symbol of his perceived limitations, now represented the quiet strength and perseverance that had brought him to where he was. Lenny carefully placed the uniform in a box, along with a few other mementos from his years as a janitor. He would keep these items in his new office as a reminder of where he came from and the perspective he had gained. As he closed the box, he made a silent vow never to forget the lessons learned during those years of invisibility. True success isn't measured by titles or wealth, but by the impact we leave on others. Sometimes the greatest victories are born from the quiet determination of those who refuse to be defined by others. Returning to his office, Lenny gazed out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars against the darkening sky. He reflected on the irony of his situation, how years of being underestimated had given him the ultimate advantage. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every moment of being treated as less than human had fueled his determination and sharpened his skills. In many ways, Lenny realized his rise to power was a form of quiet revenge, not the bitter, destructive kind, but the kind that builds something better. He had proven wrong every person who had ever looked down on him, not through confrontation or cruelty, but through intelligence, perseverance, and an unwavering belief in his own worth. As the days turned into weeks and months, Lenny's leadership continued to transform Everest. The company became known not just for its financial success, but for its ethical practices and innovative workplace culture. Industry publications wrote glowing articles about the Janitor CEO who had revolutionized corporate America. But for Lenny, the most satisfying moments were the small, everyday interactions, the thank you notes from staff members whose lives had been improved by the changes he had implemented. One day, as Lenny was leaving the office, he overheard a conversation between two interns. They were discussing their career aspirations, and one said to the other, "I want to be like Mr. Johnson someday. Not just successful, but respected. Someone who makes a real difference." Lenny smiled to himself as he walked past unnoticed. It was moments like these that made everything worthwhile. As the first anniversary of his takeover approached, Lenny decided to implement one final change. He established the Everest Opportunity Fund, a program designed to provide education and career advancement opportunities to underprivileged individuals. The first recipients would be the children of employees who couldn't otherwise afford college, with a special focus on those interested in business and finance. At the announcement ceremony, Lenny stood before a crowd of employees, their families, and members of the press. As he spoke about the fund and its goals, he couldn't help but think of his younger self, the ambitious college graduate who had faced closed door after closed door. "Success," Lenny said, his voice filled with emotion, "is not about the position you hold or the power you wield. It's about the impact you have on the lives of others. Each of us, regardless of our role, has the power to make a difference, to lift others up, to challenge the status quo, and to create a world where everyone is valued and respected." He paused, looking out over the audience. "I stand before you today not as a CEO, not as a former janitor, but as someone who believes in the potential of every single person in this room and beyond. Together, we can build a future where no one is overlooked, where every voice is heard, and where the measure of a person is not their title, but their character and contributions to society." As applause filled the room, Lenny felt a sense of completion. His journey had come full circle. Yes, he had transformed Everest, but more importantly, he had created a legacy of respect, opportunity, and compassion that would outlast his tenure. Later that evening, as Lenny prepared to leave the office, he stopped by the janitor's closet one last time. He picked up a mop and began cleaning the nearby hallway, much to the surprise of a passing employee. "Mr. Johnson," the employee exclaimed. "What are you doing? We can call someone to take care of that." Lenny smiled, continuing his work. "There's dignity in every job well done," he replied, "and sometimes it's good to remember where you came from to appreciate where you are." As he mopped the floor, Lenny felt a profound sense of peace. He had achieved more than he had ever dreamed possible, not just in terms of personal success, but in creating real, meaningful change. And yet, here he was, still the same man who took pride in a clean floor and a job well done. In that moment, Lenny knew that his greatest achievement wasn't becoming CEO or outsmarting those who had underestimated him. It was staying true to himself, valuing every person and every task, no matter how small. As he finished cleaning and put the mop away, Lenny Johnson, janitor, strategist, leader, and agent of change, walked out of Everest Corporate Solutions, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The story of the janitor who became CEO would be told for years to come, inspiring countless others to persevere, to dream big, and to never underestimate the power of quiet determination. But for Lenny, the real story was much simpler. It was about a man who refused to be defined by others' perceptions, who used his experiences to fuel positive change, and who never forgot the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. As we rise from humble beginnings, the true measure of success lies not in the power we gain, but in how we lift others along the way. The journey isn't just personal, it's a legacy for all to follow. As Lenny stepped out into the cool night air, he glanced back at the gleaming tower of Everest Corporate Solutions. He didn't just see a successful company, he saw a symbol of what could be achieved when potential is nurtured, no matter where it begins. In the reflection of those towering windows, he saw more than just profits and business accomplishments. He saw the stories of the countless people who had been given the chance to thrive under his leadership. The building stood as a testament to the idea that every person, regardless of their background or starting point, has the potential to achieve greatness. Lenny's journey from janitor to CEO was proof that the quiet determination of an individual could reshape not only their own life but the lives of those around them. With a satisfied smile, Lenny turned away from the towering structure and walked into the future he had worked so hard to create. A future bright with possibility for everyone, from the janitors to the executives and everyone in between. A future built on respect, dignity, and opportunity for all. But what if I told you this isn't the only time someone underestimated and mistreated simply because of how they looked? Just like Layla, there's a man, a janitor, quietly mocked, ignored, and underestimated for years. What no one knew was that behind the broom, he was planning something extraordinary. When the moment finally came, it wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about turning the tables in a way they never saw coming. Let me tell you how the janitor's revenge unfolded and how he fired his own boss. When a cashier and a security guard begin to suspect a pregnant woman of stealing, the case takes a threatening turn. All Layla wanted was to buy food, but now she has to defend herself against false accusations. But when the man she called for help enters the store, the situation changes in the blink of an eye. What will happen when the truth comes out? Don't miss this story. Subscribe to the channel to find out how it ends, and post in the comments where you're watching this video from. It was a particularly long and exhausting day for Layla. Being in the final trimester of her pregnancy was no easy feat. Her back ached, her feet throbbed from the constant swelling, and fatigue seemed to hang on her like a heavy weight. Yet, there was still so much to do. She glanced at her phone to check the time. It was getting late, and she needed to pick up groceries before heading home. Her husband James would be home soon, and she wanted to have everything ready for dinner. Layla found herself near one of the city's more upscale supermarkets, a place she didn't frequent often, but decided to visit today due to convenience. It was known for its fresh organic products and high prices, catering mostly to wealthier patrons. She often felt out of place in such spaces, especially now with her swollen belly, tired appearance, and the discomfort that seemed to grow with each step. But tonight, she didn't have the energy to care. She needed to get in and get out as quickly as possible, as Layla pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped inside. A cold blast of air from the store's ventilation system greeted her. She sighed with relief, grateful for the coolness against her overheated skin. However, her relief was short-lived. From the moment she entered the store, she felt eyes on her. The security guard stationed near the entrance gave her a long, lingering look. Layla caught his gaze for a moment, but he didn't look away. His stare made her uneasy, but she brushed it off as her own paranoia. After all, she was just a pregnant woman buying groceries. There was no reason for anyone to be suspicious. Yet, as she moved through the store's aisles, gathering items for her dinner, the uncomfortable feeling of being watched grew stronger. Each step she took, it seemed like someone's gaze followed her. It was as though she was an anomaly here, an outsider in a place where she didn't belong. The occasional shopper would glance at her, some with mild curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. She noticed, too, that the employees were unusually attentive to her movements. They lingered in her aisle longer than necessary, straightening items that didn't need straightening or giving her strained smiles. Layla tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling herself she was imagining things. She had more important things to worry about. The baby inside her kicked gently, as if sensing her discomfort, and Layla placed a hand on her belly, whispering a soft reassurance. Almost done, she murmured to herself. After grabbing a few more items, a carton of milk, some vegetables, and a loaf of fresh bread, Layla made her way to the front of the store, pushing her cart toward the checkout lanes. She selected one of the shorter lines and began unloading her items onto the conveyor belt, one by one, her movements slow and deliberate, the weight of her pregnancy making every action more laborious than usual. The cashier, a young man in his mid-20s, glanced at her briefly before scanning the first item. At first, it seemed like a routine transaction. He beeped the items through the scanner, glancing occasionally at Layla, but otherwise not paying much attention. However, as the transaction progressed, Layla noticed a change in his demeanor. His casual indifference gave way to something else, something more calculating. His eyes shifted down toward her swollen belly, and then back up to her face, narrowing slightly. He hesitated for a moment before continuing, his eyes flickering with suspicion. Layla shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Unsure of what was happening, she could feel the weight of his scrutiny growing, making her feel self-conscious in a way that was both unsettling and invasive. "Are you doing okay?" the cashier asked suddenly, his voice flat, though the words seemed loaded with something unspoken. Layla blinked, momentarily taken aback by the question. "Yes, I'm fine, just tired," she replied, trying to keep her tone polite despite the irritation that crept into her voice. She was in no mood for small talk, especially not from a cashier who seemed to be eyeing her like she was hiding something. The cashier gave her a half-hearted nod but said nothing more. As he continued to scan the last of her items, Layla felt a strange tension in the air. She glanced at the security guard who had been stationed near the entrance earlier. He was now standing closer, watching the exchange with keen interest, his gaze darting between her and the cashier. Anxiety began to bubble up inside her. What was going on? Why were they acting like this? When the cashier finished scanning, he turned to her again, this time with an even more pronounced suspicion in his eyes. "Can you wait here for a moment?" he asked abruptly, not giving her a chance to respond before stepping away from the register. Layla's heart sank. She watched as he whispered something to another employee nearby, and soon after, the store's manager, a tall, older man with a stern expression, walked toward her. "Is there a problem?" Layla asked, her voice betraying the growing knot of anxiety in her chest. The manager stopped in front of her, glancing briefly at her cart before turning his attention to her belly. He didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he looked at her in a way that made her feel small and insignificant, as if she were already guilty of some unseen crime. "Ma'am," he began slowly, his tone icy and formal. "We've had a few incidents of theft recently. Just as a precaution, we'd like to ask you a few questions." Layla's heart raced. "What do you mean, incidents of theft? I haven't stolen anything." The manager's eyes flickered towards her stomach again, and Layla suddenly realized what was happening. They weren't just suspicious of her. They thought she was hiding something under her clothing. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her first reaction was disbelief. Then slowly, that disbelief gave way to anger. "Are you accusing me of stealing?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of frustration and humiliation. "We're not accusing anyone of anything yet," the manager said smoothly, though his words felt anything but neutral. "We just need to be sure." Layla's hands instinctively moved to her belly, protective and defensive. "I'm pregnant. I'm not hiding anything. This is my child." The manager didn't seem convinced. He motioned toward the security guard who had now approached the scene. "We just need to check to make sure, ma'am. If everything is fine, you can be on your way." Layla couldn't believe what she was hearing. They thought her pregnancy was a ruse, that she was pretending to be pregnant to smuggle stolen goods out of the store. The sheer absurdity of the accusation left her momentarily speechless. "I'm not showing you anything," she said finally, her voice firm despite the rising panic inside her. "This is ridiculous." The manager's expression hardened, and the security guard stepped forward, his presence looming. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to take further action. We have the right to check if there's any suspicion of theft." Tears of frustration welled up in Layla's eyes. How had a simple trip to the grocery store turned into this? She could feel her pulse racing, her hands trembling as she clutched the handle of the cart. She had done nothing wrong, But here she was, being treated like a criminal because of their unfounded suspicions. "I told you," Layla said through gritted teeth. "I haven't stolen anything." But the manager and the security guard were unmoved. The tension between them thickened as the security guard took another step closer. Layla's body tensed, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what to do next. The overwhelming sense of helplessness threatened to consume her. Shoppers around her had started to notice the commotion. Some whispered to each other, glancing at her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. It felt as though the whole world was closing in on her, and there was no escape. She needed to get out of this nightmare. But how? Layla stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel her pulse throbbing in her temples as the weight of the situation bore down on her. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. The manager's cold stare, the cashier's judgmental glances, and the security guard looming ominously close all confirmed what she feared. They truly believed she was a thief. She looked around, hoping for some sign of support from the other shoppers, but their faces reflected only mild curiosity, as though watching a scene unfold that had nothing to do with them. Some whispered to one another, eyes darting between Layla and the growing confrontation, while others simply looked away, uninterested in involving themselves. The manager, whose name tag read Gary, stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest. "Ma'am," he began, his tone laced with condescension. "This will be much easier for everyone if you just cooperate." Layla's breath hitched. She glanced nervously at the exit, only a few yards away. But the security guard had strategically placed himself between her and the door. There was no easy escape. Layla could feel the sweat forming at the nape of her neck, and her hands tightened instinctively around the handle of her shopping cart. "I told you, I haven't stolen anything," she repeated, her voice strained. "I'm just here to buy groceries. I'm pregnant. What you're accusing me of is completely wrong." The manager sighed as though dealing with a difficult child. "Ma'am, this isn't personal. We just have to make sure." His words felt like a slap in the face. Not personal? How could it not be personal? They weren't just accusing her of shoplifting, they were attacking her dignity, her very identity. Layla could feel a storm of emotions rising inside her. Anger, humiliation, frustration. It took everything in her not to lash out. "I won't let you humiliate me like this," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not a thief." Gary motioned to the security guard, whose name tag read John. He was a broad-shouldered man with a stern face and eyes that seemed to gleam with authority. John stepped forward, his imposing figure casting a shadow over Layla, as if to physically underscore the pressure being placed upon her. "Look, lady," John said, his voice rough and direct. "We've had a string of incidents with people using fake pregnancies to hide stolen goods. This is just standard procedure. If you're innocent, you've got nothing to worry about." Layla's pulse quickened. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. They actually thought her pregnancy was fake, that she had somehow orchestrated this elaborate ruse to steal from the store. "It was beyond insulting," John continued, his tone growing more impatient with each passing second. "We can do this the easy way, or we can call the police. But one way or another, we need to check what's going on." Layla's head was spinning. The situation was escalating far faster than she could handle. Her immediate instinct was to stand her ground, to refuse to let them strip her of her dignity in front of a store full of strangers. But at the same time, the growing pressure was making it harder to think clearly. She had come here for something as mundane as groceries, and now she was being cornered and threatened as though she were some kind of criminal mastermind. She could feel the stares from the other customers growing more intense. What must they be thinking? That she was guilty? That she really was hiding something? It was as though she were already on trial, and these strangers were the jury. "Why don't you just let me leave?" Layla asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I didn't do anything wrong, and I don't deserve to be treated this way." "You can leave," Gary responded coldly. "But not until we've cleared up this situation. We're just asking you to cooperate. Let us check, and if there's nothing to hide, you'll be free to go." His words were like a trap, dangling before her. Layla knew that even if she did cooperate, the humiliation would remain. It would be a violation of her privacy, her humanity, all based on nothing more than suspicion, fueled by racial and sexist biases, and if she refused, the police would be called, and things could get even worse. She felt caught in a vice, unable to move in any direction without causing herself more harm. The panic in her chest was growing, the world around her seeming to close in. She could feel her stomach tightening, not from anything physical, but from the overwhelming stress of the moment. Her baby kicked lightly, as if sensing her distress, and Layla instinctively placed her hand over her belly, trying to soothe the child inside. "Please," Layla began, her voice quieter now. "I'm telling the truth. I'm just trying to buy groceries." Gary glanced at John, and they both exchanged a look that made Layla's stomach churn. They had already made up their minds. "We've heard it all before," John said dismissively. "People come in here with all kinds of stories. We've got a job to do." Layla opened her mouth to protest again, but before she could say anything, John took a step closer. His hand resting on the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. The implication was clear. He was more than ready to escalate the situation if she didn't comply. A wave of nausea hit Layla, the stress overwhelming her. She could feel her legs trembling under her, and her head began to spin. She had never felt so trapped, so utterly powerless. For a brief moment she considered fleeing, making a break for the door, and escaping this nightmare. But where would that lead? They'd chase her down, and that would only make things worse. The thought of being tackled or handcuffed was unbearable. And worse yet, what would happen if the police arrived? Would they believe her? Or would they see her as just another suspect, another black woman they could treat however they wanted? She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat nearly choking her. "I'm not going to let you do this to me," Layla said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You can't force me to strip in front of everyone. I won't let you." Gary's expression darkened. "You don't have a choice, ma'am. Either you cooperate, or we'll have to involve the authorities." John shifted his weight, looking like he was ready to act. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Layla could feel her body teetering on the edge of panic. She knew she had to think quickly, but every possible solution seemed to lead to more humiliation or danger. Her heart raced as the seconds ticked by. The store's fluorescent lights felt harsh against her skin, and the murmurs of the crowd behind her grew louder, feeding her anxiety. "I have rights," Layla blurted out, her voice rising. "You can't just accuse me of something because of the way I look. I'm pregnant, for God's sake." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. John raised an eyebrow, unimpressed, while Gary crossed his arms tighter, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We don't care what you look like, ma'am," Gary said, though the false politeness in his tone betrayed his lie. "We just need to check. Either you let us do our job, or the police will do it for us." Layla's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the tears stinging at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. She wouldn't cry in front of these people. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But the weight of the moment was crashing down on her, suffocating her. And she knew that if she didn't make a decision soon, things could spiral out of control. The crowd was growing larger now. More shoppers had gathered nearby, drawn by the commotion. Some had their phones out, subtly filming the interaction. Layla's humiliation deepened. The last thing she wanted was to become some viral video, a spectacle for people to gossip about online. Yet here she was, on the verge of being dragged into something she had no control over. Her pulse raced. What could she do? Should she comply, just to get it over with? But the very thought of stripping in front of these strangers, of allowing them to paw through her personal life, as though she were nothing more than a criminal, made her stomach churn. Just then, a voice crackled through John's walkie-talkie, breaking the tense silence. It was a call for backup. Layla's chest tightened even further. They weren't going to let this go. She could feel the walls closing in on her, and her options slipping away. "Call the police if you want," she said, her voice stronger now, though her heart pounded in her chest. "But I'm not going to let you treat me like this. I've done nothing wrong, and I won't be bullied into submission." John's jaw clenched, his hand twitching towards his radio. Layla could see the irritation in his face, the way he was itching to take control of the situation. It was at that moment that Layla made a decision. She didn't want to call James. She had never wanted to involve him in something like this, especially not at work. But she could feel the situation slipping out of her control, and if she didn't act soon, things were going to get much worse. Her hand shook as she pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen felt cold and unfamiliar in her trembling fingers. She scrolled through her contacts, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. Then she found the name, James. With a deep breath, Layla hit the call button. Layla's hands trembled as she clutched the phone, listening to the dial tone. Each second felt like an eternity, her mind racing as she waited for James to pick up. The oppressive weight of the situation bore down on her, making it hard to breathe. The air in the store felt heavy, suffocating, as if everyone around her were watching her every move, waiting for her to crack. She didn't want to involve James. She didn't want to be the woman who called her husband every time something went wrong, especially not when he was at work. But this wasn't just about her anymore. The baby inside her kicked again, a gentle reminder of the life she carried, and that gave her the strength she needed to continue. But before James could answer, the phone call was interrupted by the blare of a police siren outside the store. Layla's heart sank. They had already called the police. Her worst fears were coming true, and she wasn't sure what was going to happen next. John, the security guard, glanced toward the front entrance, his expression hardening as the flashing blue lights illuminated the glass doors. The tension in the air thickened, and Layla's stomach churned. She had hoped she would have more time to explain, time to think, time to breathe. But now it was too late. "Looks like we don't need to wait," John muttered, casting a smug glance in Layla's direction. The arrogance in his voice made her skin crawl. The manager, Gary, stood by silently, his arms still crossed, as if he were confident that everything was about to be resolved in his favor. Layla could see it in his eyes, the way he believed that justice would come in the form of a police officer siding with him. He wasn't worried about being wrong. He wasn't worried about what would happen to Layla. He was only concerned with proving his assumptions right. The door chimed as it swung open, and in walked a police officer. He was tall and broad, his posture rigid and authoritative. Layla's heart sank even further when she saw the look on his face, cold, distant, and entirely uninterested in her side of the story. His name tag read Officer Henson, and he exuded an air of casual superiority, as though this was just another routine day at work for him. Officer Henson scanned the scene, his eyes immediately locking onto Layla. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his gaze that made her feel even smaller, more vulnerable. It was a look she had seen before, one that said, "I've already made up my mind." "So what's the issue here?" Officer Henson asked, his voice low and disinterested. He addressed Gary and John, completely ignoring Layla's presence, as if she were nothing more than an object in the room, rather than the person at the center of this unfolding disaster. Gary cleared his throat and stepped forward, speaking with an air of authority. "We have reason to believe this woman is attempting to shoplift," he explained, his tone calm and measured. "She's been acting suspiciously, and we suspect she's hiding stolen merchandise under her clothing." Layla's mouth went dry as the words left Gary's lips. The accusation felt even more real, more damning, now that it had been spoken aloud in front of law enforcement. She wanted to shout, to protest, to tell them how wrong they were, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat. Officer Henson nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Layla. "Is that right?" he asked, his tone flat, as though he had already heard enough. Layla's body tensed. This was the moment she had feared. She had hoped, maybe even prayed, that the officer would come in and see the situation for what it was, a horrible misunderstanding. But the way he was looking at her told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't here to help. He was here to confirm their suspicions, to play his part in this humiliating spectacle. John, ever the enforcer, stepped in to reinforce the claim. "She refused to cooperate when we asked her to show us what's under her shirt," he added, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's been resisting this whole time." Layla's blood boiled. "I'm not resisting," she finally managed to say, her voice sharp and filled with frustration. "I told you, I'm pregnant. I haven't stolen anything." "This is insane." But Officer Henson didn't seem fazed by her protest. He merely looked at her with that same detached expression, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he were weighing her words and finding them lacking. Gary, taking advantage of the moment, continued. "We've had issues with theft in the store recently," he said. "People have been using disguises to conceal stolen goods, and frankly, her behavior has been suspicious since she walked in." "Suspicious?" Layla repeated incredulously. "I'm just buying groceries. How is that suspicious?" But once again, it was as if no one was listening to her. The men around her were intent on discussing her fate without giving her a voice in the matter. She could feel the walls closing in, the tension mounting with every second that passed. Officer Henson stepped closer to her now, his gaze hardening as he assessed her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone low and threatening, "we're going to need you to comply. If you have nothing to hide, there's no reason not to cooperate." The words echoed in her mind, no reason not to cooperate. As if what they were asking of her was reasonable, as if it wasn't an outright violation of her dignity and her humanity. They weren't just asking her to cooperate, they were demanding that she strip away every ounce of her self-respect to prove that she wasn't the criminal they had already decided she was. "I'm not showing you anything," Layla said firmly, though her voice shook with the weight of the moment. "I've done nothing wrong, and you have no right to treat me like this." Officer Henson's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. Either you comply, or we're going to have to take you into custody." Custody. The words sent a shockwave of fear through Layla's body. The idea of being handcuffed, thrown into the back of a police car, and treated like a common criminal for something she didn't even do was too much to bear. She could feel her heart racing, the pulse in her throat pounding as panic threatened to overtake her. But she couldn't give in. She couldn't let them strip her of everything she had worked for, everything she was. "Not like this. I'm not going anywhere," Layla said, her voice growing more defiant. "I'm pregnant. You can't just drag me out of here and arrest me for nothing." But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Officer Henson reached for his handcuffs, his expression cold and unyielding. "That's it," he said. "You've made your choice." The sight of the handcuffs sent a jolt of terror through Layla's body. She could barely think, barely breathe. Her mind was racing with fear and confusion. What was she supposed to do now? How had things escalated this far? It was in that moment, when she felt like the world was about to collapse around her, that the doors of the store opened again. A familiar voice called out across the tension-filled air, a voice that instantly cut through the panic and chaos. "Layla, James." Her husband's voice was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of despair. All eyes turned toward the entrance as James strode into the store, his presence commanding and undeniable. Dressed in his police uniform, the badge on his chest gleaming under the fluorescent lights, James looked every bit the authority figure that Officer Henson and the others had pretended to be. But unlike them, his authority came with integrity, with a deep sense of justice that had always defined him. Layla's heart swelled with relief as she saw him. She had never wanted to drag him into this mess. But now, more than ever, she was glad he was here. James's eyes scanned the scene quickly. Taking in the sight of the handcuffs in Officer Henson's hand, the tense expressions on Gary and John's faces, and the panic on Lila's, James demanded, "What the hell is going on here?" His voice cut through the silence like a knife. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Lila and the men who had been so eager to take her down. Officer Henson stiffened, clearly not expecting another police officer to intervene. "We have a situation here," he said, his voice clipped. "This woman is refusing to cooperate in a shoplifting investigation." James's eyes narrowed as he glanced between the men and Lila. "A shoplifting investigation?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "And you think handcuffing a pregnant woman is the way to handle it?" Gary stepped forward, clearly trying to salvage control of the situation. "Sir, we had reason to believe she was hiding stolen goods under her clothing. She refused to comply with our requests for a search, and we felt we had no other choice." James turned his full attention to Gary now, his expression unreadable but deadly calm. "No other choice? You didn't have any other choice but to accuse my wife of stealing and threaten her with arrest without any proof?" Layla could feel the tension shift. The men, who had been so confident moments ago, were now faltering, unsure of how to respond. Officer Henson cleared his throat, still holding the handcuffs but no longer as eager to use them. "We were just following procedure," he said defensively. "She wouldn't cooperate." James took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, icy tone. "You don't get to treat people like this, especially not without reason. I suggest you rethink your procedure before you make things a lot worse for yourselves," James said. The air was thick with tension, but Lila could finally breathe again. James was here. He was standing up for her. And he wasn't going to let them take her down without a fight. Lila stood frozen, her hand gripping James's arm as tightly as she could, trying to ground herself in the chaos. The relief that washed over her at his arrival was quickly overshadowed by the intensity of the brewing confrontation. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, could hear the faint murmur from the crowd that had gathered to witness the drama unfold. James was calm, but Lila knew him well enough to sense the simmering anger beneath his composed exterior. His eyes darted between Officer Henson, the smug manager Gary, and the towering security guard John. The handcuffs that Officer Henson still held seemed to gleam menacingly, a reminder of just how far this had gone. "Look," Officer Henson began, his tone still sharp but now edged with uncertainty. "We had a problem call. Your wife refused to cooperate, and the store has the right to detain anyone they suspect of shoplifting." "Suspect?" James repeated, his voice laced with barely concealed fury. "On what grounds? What exactly makes you think a pregnant woman, my wife, was shoplifting? I'd love to hear the reasoning behind this brilliant deduction." Gary, the manager, cleared his throat, stepping forward as if eager to take control of the narrative. "Sir, we've had several incidents recently where people have used fake pregnancies as a cover for theft. She was acting suspiciously, and when we asked her to comply with a search, she refused. We were well within our rights to involve the authorities." Layla's stomach churned. The absurdity of what they were accusing her of felt like a cruel joke, but the stakes were all too real. It wasn't just about this moment, it was about how often she had to face this kind of treatment. Being judged, suspected, and mistreated simply because of her appearance. She could feel the injustice burning beneath her skin, and despite James's presence, the fear hadn't fully dissipated. They weren't backing down. James clenched his jaw, the muscles in his face tightening as he processed Gary's words. Layla could sense the internal battle within him, his natural instinct to protect her, clashing with his desire to maintain composure in a situation that demanded diplomacy. But James wasn't just any man. He was a police captain, someone who knew how to handle authority and control a situation. He wouldn't allow these people to intimidate him or his wife. "Acting suspiciously?" James said slowly, his voice low and measured. "And what exactly does that mean? What was she doing that made you so certain she was guilty?" Gary hesitated, his confidence wavering under James's unrelenting gaze. He glanced at John for support, but the security guard seemed just as unsure now, no longer so eager to press forward with his accusations. She seemed to be avoiding eye contact. Gary stumbled over his words, clearly trying to come up with something that would justify the situation. "And she had her hand on her stomach the whole time. We thought she might be hiding something under her shirt." Layla's jaw dropped. "I'm pregnant," she shouted, her frustration boiling over. "Of course I had my hand on my stomach. I'm carrying a child, not stolen goods." The crowd around them murmured, some shifting uncomfortably as they realized just how ridiculous the accusation sounded. Layla could feel the humiliation rising in her chest again, her hands trembling as she struggled to contain her anger. She wanted to scream at them, to demand that they acknowledge how wrong they were, but she knew it wouldn't matter. They had already made up their minds the moment she walked into the store. James took a step forward, his body language exuding authority. He was no longer just a husband defending his wife, he was a police captain asserting his power in a situation that had spiraled out of control. "So let me get this straight," James said, his tone dangerously calm. "You accused my wife, who is visibly pregnant, of stealing because she had her hand on her stomach. That's your suspicious behavior? And you thought the appropriate response was to threaten her with handcuffs and drag her out of the store like a criminal?" Officer Henson shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the situation had taken a turn he wasn't prepared for. He glanced at the crowd, clearly aware that more and more people were watching closely. Some were even filming the interaction with their phones. The last thing Officer Henson needed was for this to blow up into a public relations nightmare. "We were just following store protocol," Officer Henson mumbled, though the conviction in his voice was fading. "We had no way of knowing whether she was pregnant or not." James's eyes flashed with fury. "Did you even bother to ask? Did any of you stop for 1 second to consider that you might be wrong, or were you so eager to believe that my wife was guilty because she didn't fit into your picture of an ideal customer?" Gary opened his mouth to respond, but James wasn't finished. "And now, instead of admitting that you made a mistake, you're doubling down, trying to justify your actions as protocol. Protocol is for situations where there's evidence of wrongdoing, not for when you feel uncomfortable because someone doesn't look the way you expect them to. You don't get to make baseless accusations and then hide behind store policy when you're called out on it." Layla's heart swelled with pride at James's words. He wasn't just standing up for her. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been treated like this, like they didn't belong, like they were guilty before being proven innocent. She could feel the shift in the room, the murmurs growing louder as the crowd began to side with them. People were nodding, some whispering to one another in agreement. The tide was turning. Officer Henson's hand, which had been resting on the handcuffs, dropped to his side. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked uncertain. "Look, Captain," Officer Henson started, addressing James by his rank now, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "I understand this is your wife, and I get that you're upset, but we're just doing our jobs here. We didn't mean for things to escalate like this." "Didn't mean for things to escalate?" James repeated, incredulous. "You threatened to arrest her. You treated her like a criminal based on nothing more than your own biases and assumptions, and you think that just doing your job excuses that?" Officer Henson took a step back, glancing nervously at the growing crowd. Gary, too, seemed to shrink under the weight of the public scrutiny. His earlier confidence, now a distant memory. Layla could see the realization dawning on them both. They had crossed a line, and now they were scrambling to find a way out without further damaging their reputations. Gary finally spoke, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "We didn't mean any harm. We just wanted to make sure the store's property was safe." James didn't let up. "The store's property? And what about my wife's dignity, her safety, her rights?" There was a long pause. The tension hung thick in the air, and Lila could feel the weight of every eye in the room on them. Her breathing was shallow, her heart still pounding in her chest, but she knew that the tide had shifted. They weren't winning because James was a police captain. They were winning because the truth was on their side, and everyone in that store knew it. Gary looked down, his face flushed with embarrassment. We didn't mean to accuse her unfairly." "But you did," James shot back, his voice unwavering. "And you're going to fix this." John, the security guard who had been mostly silent throughout the confrontation, stepped forward now, clearly trying to salvage some sense of authority. "What do you want us to do?" he asked, his tone more conciliatory than before. James squared his shoulders. "First, you're going to apologize to my wife, publicly. And then you're going to make sure that this never happens again, not just to her, but to anyone. You're going to rethink your so-called protocols, and you're going to start treating people like human beings, not potential criminals." Layla watched as Gary and John exchanged uneasy glances. The crowd was watching them closely. Now waiting for their response, the power dynamics had shifted, and they knew it. Finally, Gary cleared his throat and turned to face Lila, his voice shaking slightly as he spoke. We're sorry, ma'am. We didn't mean to cause you any distress. It was a misunderstanding." It wasn't much of an apology, but it was something. Leela nodded, her face still flushed with the adrenaline of the confrontation. She wasn't going to push for more, she just wanted this nightmare to be over. James, however, wasn't finished. "And what about you?" he asked, turning to Officer Henson. The officer stiffened slightly, clearly uncomfortable with being put on the spot in front of so many people. "We're sorry for how this played out," Officer Henson said finally, his voice lacking any real remorse but clearly eager to end the confrontation. "We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." James didn't look entirely satisfied, but he nodded curtly. "See that it doesn't." The tension in the room began to dissipate, though the stares from the crowd remained. Lila felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, the emotional toll of the confrontation finally catching up to her. Her body ached, and she wanted nothing more than to go home and put this horrible experience behind her. But as she glanced around at the people in the store, the ones who had watched in silence, who had done nothing to intervene, she felt a mixture of emotions. She was proud of how she had stood her ground, but she was also painfully aware of how easily things could have gone the other way. She had James to protect her, but what about those who didn't? As James placed a protective arm around her shoulders and began guiding her toward the exit, Lila couldn't help but wonder how many more times she would have to fight this same battle. How many more times people would look at her and see a suspect, a threat, rather than a person. The doors of the store closed behind them with a soft chime, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Lila could finally breathe. As soon as the heavy glass doors of the store closed behind them, she let out a long, shaky breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but it did little to soothe the turbulence inside her. She walked slowly, her body feeling heavier than it had all day, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. James kept a protective arm around her, but Lila was only half aware of his presence. Her mind was miles away. The confrontation inside the store had ended, but the emotional weight of what had just happened lingered like a dark cloud. She was safe now, physically at least, but the sting of humiliation and fear still gripped her tightly, refusing to let go. Her heart continued to pound, her pulse echoing in her ears as she replayed the events over and over again, searching for what she could have done differently, for a way she could have avoided the situation entirely. How had it come to this? A simple trip to the grocery store had turned into a public spectacle, and for what? Because she was a black woman who had dared to shop in an upscale supermarket while visibly pregnant. The absurdity of the accusations still gnawed at her, but what hurt the most wasn't just the baselessness of the claims. It was the fact that it had happened at all. That people had been so quick to assume the worst of her, to believe she was guilty before she had a chance to defend herself. As they reached the car, Lila stopped, leaning heavily against the passenger door. She was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. Her entire body felt like it was made of lead, weighed down by the shame and frustration that refused to dissipate. James turned to her, his eyes filled with concern. "Lila, are you okay?" His voice was gentle, but it was laced with the same anger that had fueled him inside the store. He had been strong for her, unwavering in his defense, but now that they were alone, she could see the toll it had taken on him as well. Lila nodded, but it was a lie. She wasn't okay. She didn't feel okay. Everything about this night had been wrong, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the emotions just wouldn't leave her alone. "I'm just tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just want to go home." James nodded, understanding. He didn't press her further. He opened the car door for her and helped her inside. As she sat down, Lila finally allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. The silence inside the car was a welcome contrast to the chaos of the store, but even as she tried to calm her racing thoughts, they refused to quiet down. James climbed into the driver's seat and started the car, but he didn't drive off immediately. Instead, he turned to her again, his brow furrowed with concern. "You don't have to talk about it right now if you don't want to," he said softly. "But if you need to, I'm here." Lila appreciated his words, but she didn't know where to begin. There was so much swirling inside her, so many emotions that she couldn't even begin to untangle them. The anger, the humiliation, the fear, it all twisted together, making it hard to think clearly. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, a tear rolled down her cheek, and Lila quickly wiped it away, frustrated with herself for crying. "Hey friends, sorry to disturb you. Please take a moment to share your name and where you're watching this video from in the comments. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Your support means the world to us and plays a crucial role in promoting our channel. Because of you, we can share these important stories and shed light on injustices. You inspire us, and together, we can make the world a better place. Enjoy the video. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to feel weak, like she couldn't handle what had just happened. But the truth was, she couldn't handle it. Not alone. The fear that had gripped her inside the store hadn't completely left her. And now that the confrontation was over, she felt exposed in a different way, vulnerable. As if the armor she had built up over years of dealing with casual racism and microaggressions had finally cracked. And now she didn't know how to rebuild it. "I hate that this happened," Lila finally whispered, her voice breaking. "I hate that this keeps happening." James reached over and took her hand, his touch grounding her, even as the storm of emotions continued to rage inside her. "I know," he said quietly. "It's not right. None of it is right." Lila squeezed his hand, feeling a fresh wave of frustration bubbling up. "I just don't understand why it always has to be this way. Why do they always assume the worst of us? Why do I have to be treated like a criminal just for walking into a store?" Her voice grew louder, her anger bubbling to the surface. "I was just trying to buy groceries, James, and they treated me like I was some kind of thief, like I wasn't even human. They didn't care that I'm pregnant, or that I was scared, or that I didn't do anything wrong. All they saw was my skin, and that was enough to make me guilty in their eyes." James listened, his expression softening as he watched her struggle to contain her emotions. "You have every right to be angry," he said, his voice steady, "and you have every right to be hurt. What they did to you was wrong. No one should have to go through that, especially not you." Lila nodded, but the tears were coming faster now, and she couldn't stop them. "I didn't want to call you," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to involve you. I didn't want to seem weak. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I couldn't." James frowned, shaking his head. "Lila, you're not weak. You're anything but weak. What you went through tonight would break most people, but you stood your ground. You did everything you could, and when it became too much, you called for help. That's not weakness. That's strength." His words should have been comforting, but instead of comforting her, James's words only made Lila feel more conflicted. She had always prided herself on being strong, on not needing anyone else to fight her battles for her. But tonight had proven that no matter how strong she thought she was, there were some battles she couldn't fight alone. And that realization was terrifying. "I feel so powerless," Lila whispered. "No matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to be strong, they'll always find a way to tear me down. How am I supposed to keep going when it feels like I'm constantly fighting just to exist?" James's grip on her hand tightened. "You keep going because you have to," he said softly. "Because the world needs people like you, Lila. People who stand up, even when it's hard. People who don't give up, even when the odds are stacked against them. What happened tonight wasn't fair, but it doesn't define you. You define you." Lila's heart clenched. She knew James was right, but it didn't make the pain any less real. It didn't make the fear any less consuming. "I'm just so tired of it all," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm tired of having to prove myself, tired of fighting, tired of being treated like I don't belong. I don't want to live like this anymore." James didn't respond right away. He simply sat with her, his presence a steady comfort in the midst of her turmoil. Lila could feel the weight of his words even before he spoke them, and when he finally did, they hit her with a force she hadn't expected. "I know you're tired," he said quietly, "but we don't get to choose this fight. It chose us. And as long as there are people out there who see us as less than human, we have to keep fighting. For ourselves, for our family, for our future. But you don't have to do it alone, Lila. You've never been alone in this." Lila wiped away her tears, her heart aching with the weight of everything they had been through. She didn't want to be tired anymore. She didn't want to feel afraid every time she stepped out of her house, wondering if today would be the day someone would decide she didn't belong. But as much as that, she wanted to retreat, to escape from the reality of their world. But she knew James was right. This was their fight. It had always been their fight, And no matter how hard it got, no matter how many times the world tried to knock them down, they had to keep getting back up. For their child, for each other, for every person who had ever felt the sting of prejudice and injustice. "I know," Lila said finally, her voice steadying. "And I'll keep fighting. But it's hard, James. It's so damn hard." James leaned over and kissed her forehead gently. "I know it is," he whispered. "But you're not in this alone. You never will be." Lila closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, she felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. It wasn't over. It would never be over. But for now, they were together, and that was enough. As they sat in the quiet of the car, Lila knew that the battle was far from over. There would be more nights like this, more moments where she felt powerless and afraid. But with James by her side, she would face them. Together they would keep fighting, because they had to. The next morning, the storm clouds from the previous night seemed to have settled, but the weight of what had happened still hung heavily over Lila. The emotions that had surged through her after the confrontation were now tempered by a sense of resolve. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was determined. The world had shown her its ugliness again, but Lila had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to face that ugliness head-on. She was not about to let those people in the store get away with what they had done. As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, her mind replayed the events over and over. The humiliation, the fear, the disbelief. It all came rushing back with every sip. James sat across from her, reading the morning paper, though she knew he was just as distracted. He kept glancing at her, waiting for her to speak, to say something about what she wanted to do next. Lila set her cup down and met his gaze. "I'm not letting this go," she said, her voice steady, though it trembled ever so slightly from the residual emotion still simmering inside her. "They can't just treat people like that, James. It wasn't just about me last night. It's about everyone who looks like me, everyone who's ever been judged before they even said a word." James nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "I know, Lila. You don't have to fight this alone. What do you want to do?" Lila had spent most of the night thinking about that very question. She didn't just want an apology, though they certainly owed her that. She wanted real accountability. She wanted people to see what had happened to her, to understand that this kind of treatment wasn't just an unfortunate incident, but part of a larger pattern of systemic discrimination. If nothing changed, then what had it all been for? "We're going back," she said firmly. "Not today, but soon. And I want them to know I'm not going to let this slide. I want a formal apology, not just some half-hearted words in private. They need to acknowledge what they did publicly. People need to know." James leaned back in his chair, thinking it over. "You're right," he agreed after a pause. "They need to be held accountable. And if they don't make it right, we can take it further." Lila appreciated his support. But she knew this wasn't just about making things right for her. It was about setting an example. She thought about all the people who had been mistreated in ways that no one ever heard about. People who didn't have someone like James to stand up for them, who had no choice but to suffer in silence. She reached for her phone and pulled up the photos and videos that had started circulating online. Several customers had recorded the confrontation in the store, and it hadn't taken long for the footage to spread. There were already thousands of comments, many expressing outrage over how she had been treated. Her story was becoming a symbol for something bigger, and that gave her a small sense of hope. Maybe this could spark real change. "I think we need to go public with this," Lila said, her voice determined. "If they don't want to take responsibility, the world will know. I'm not going to let them sweep this under the rug." James nodded, though his expression was cautious. "Are you ready for that kind of attention? Once it's out there, you can't take it back." Lila sighed, considering his words. She knew he was right. Once they went public, there would be no turning back. But she also knew that silence was no longer an option. "I'm ready," she said finally. "We need to do this for everyone who's been through something like this and never had their voice heard." James reached across the table and took her hand. "Whatever you need, I'm with you," he said, his voice filled with quiet strength. Lila smiled faintly, grateful for his unwavering support. They had been through so much together, and she knew that whatever came next, they would face it as a team. 2 days later, they returned to the store. Lila's stomach churned as they pulled into the parking lot. The memory of that night still haunted her, but she had steeled herself for what was about to happen. She had prepared her statement, rehearsed her words, and James had contacted the local press to ensure that this wouldn't be ignored. As they walked toward the entrance, Lila could feel the tension in the air. She knew that people would be watching, that this was her moment to take control of the narrative. She wasn't just here for herself. She was here for every Black woman, for every person who had ever been wrongfully accused, humiliated, or mistreated because of who they were. When they stepped inside, it didn't take long for the manager, Gary, to notice them. His face paled when he saw James in his uniform and Lila beside him, her posture strong and determined. He clearly wasn't expecting them to return, much less with such confidence. "Ma'am, sir, can we speak privately?" Gary asked, his voice lacking the arrogance it had carried just days earlier. "We'll speak here," Lila said firmly, "and I want everyone to hear it." The store had already begun to fill with customers, many of whom had recognized her from the viral videos. Some were already recording on their phones, sensing that something important was about to happen. Lila took a deep breath, letting the strength of the moment fill her. "First," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "I want to hear an apology, not just to me, but to everyone who has ever been treated unfairly in this store." Gary swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with the public scrutiny. He glanced at James, then back at Lila, knowing he had no choice but to comply. We apologize," Gary stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We deeply regret the way you were treated, and we're committed to reviewing our policies to make sure nothing like this happens again." "That's not enough," Lila said, her tone sharp. "I don't want empty promises. I want action. You need to change the way you treat people who walk through these doors. I'm not just a customer, I'm a person, and you treated me like a criminal." Gary nodded, his face flushed with shame. "We understand, and we're working on it. We'll be implementing new training programs for all staff to ensure that everyone is treated with respect, regardless of appearance or assumptions." Lila felt a surge of triumph, but she wasn't done yet. "I want this apology made public," she said. "A formal statement acknowledging what happened and committing to real changes. And I want to see those changes implemented. If they're not, we'll take this to the next level." Gary's face blanched. He knew the store couldn't afford a public scandal, not with the videos already circulating online. He nodded quickly, eager to avoid further conflict. "Yes, ma'am, we'll issue a public apology. You have my word." Lila nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. She had done it. She had faced down the people who had wronged her and demanded accountability. It wasn't just about the apology, it was about the fact that they couldn't get away with treating her, or anyone else, like they were less than human. James stood beside her, his expression proud. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Gary shook his head, clearly eager for the encounter to end. "No, sir, we'll make sure this never happens again." Lila turned to leave, but as she walked toward the exit, she noticed something important. The eyes of the customers, the employees, the people who had been watching, they weren't just staring at her anymore. They were nodding, murmuring in agreement. And for the first time, Lila felt like her voice had truly been heard. As they stepped outside into the fresh air, Lila let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The fight wasn't over, but it was a start. Justice wasn't always immediate or perfect, but today it was a small victory. And that was enough. That night, Lila sat beside James on the couch, watching the news coverage of their day. The store's apology had gone public, and people were already talking about the changes being made. She knew it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a step in the right direction. "I'm proud of you," James said quietly, wrapping his arm around her. Lila smiled, leaning into him. "I'm proud of us," she replied. "We didn't let them win." James kissed her forehead gently. "No, we didn't, and we never will." Lila closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his embrace. The battle had been exhausting, but for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. Together they had faced injustice, and together they had made a difference. And for Lila, That was everything. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you want to hear more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new episodes. Also, check out our other videos. You'll find even more exciting and unexpected stories. Write in the comments what you think of this story and where you're watching from.